Thomas Stonewall Jackson embodied the traits of a true American leader. He was born to lead and had the qualities to do so. He could inspire and encourage hundreds of thousands. He was extremely brave and instilled that bravery and courage into his men. As a Southern Civil War general, he won battles that no other man could even conceive of winning. His bravery, courage, and inspirational traits earned him respect from his own men, but also the entire United States of America. Jackson had a very difficult childhood. He was orphaned at a young age and was raised by paternal guardians. He had no formal education and was extremely poor. Jackson had one sister, with whom he was very close with, but during the Civil War, this relationship would be destroyed when she sided with the North. He was accepted to West Point, worked hard, and graduated at the top of his class. After graduation, Jackson was appointed a second lieutenant and commanded artillery units during the Mexican-American War. His fighting style was aggressive and brash. He could be counted on to be right in the middle of any battle, leading his men with his deeds and bravery. Throughout his entire career, this would be Jackson's leadership style. He led not just by words, but also by his actions. Prior to the Civil War, Jackson taught at the VMI. His charismatic personality and speaking ability made him a popular instructor. His students wanted to hear what he had to say, and he ignited passion in many of them. These students also later in the Civil War followed him into battle. More than 150 years later, Jackson is enshrined at the VMI and a central part of their traditions. Jackson was an extremely religious man, and this strong connection with God carried over to his fearlessness on the battlefield. In a letter to his wife, Jackson wrote, "My religious belief teaches me to feel as safe in battle as in bed. God has fixed the time for my death. I do not concern myself about that, but to be always ready, no matter when it may overtake me. That is the way all men should live, and then all would be equally brave." The first significant battle of the Civil War occurred at the First Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861. It was a clash between two inexperienced and disorganized armies. The Union Army began to push back the Confederate Army. Southern General Bernard Bee's forces were on the verge of defeat. Jackson and his brigade came to provide reinforcements for them. General Bee yelled to his men to look at Jackson and said, "There is Jackson, standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians." Jackson and his men continued to fight fearlessly and forced the Union into eventually retreating. The South had won their first major battle of the Civil War because of Jackson's heroic leadership. This is also how he got his name, Stonewall. In the spring of 1862, the North's strategic plan was to send Union armies from the Shenandoah Valley to meet with another Union army on the Virginian Peninsula to capture Richmond. Jackson's plan was to divert, distract, and destroy Union armies scattered throughout the Shenandoah Valley. It was critical that they prevent these armies from becoming involved in the assault of Richmond. Jackson's men were outnumbered, near starvation, lacked proper clothing, guns, and equipment, and had little hope of reinforcements. In the Shenandoah, his troop movements were secretive and swift, so swift that Union officers thought that they were impossible, and kept Northern forces off balance. Jackson's foot cavalry marches and counter-marches sometimes mystified his own men as much as the enemy. From March 23rd to June 9th in 1862, Jackson led his army all over the Shenandoah Valley attacking Union armies. At 5 different battlefields, Jackson's armies fought 5 different armies and defeated all of them. Most of the Northern armies retreated, and Jackson kept them from joining forces against him. Jackson's Shenandoah Valley victories were spectacular for the South and devastating for the North. Lincoln, the federal government, and the military remained in constant fear while Jackson was alive that he would turn his army towards Washington, D.C. at any time. Historians noted that the impact of Jackson had on the people of the South. In the early spring of 1862, Southern morale was at a low point, and prospects for the Confederacy's survival seemed bleak. By the late summer of 1862, the South had begun to believe that they had a chance to win thanks to the leadership of Stonewall Jackson. With the success of his Valley Campaign, Stonewall Jackson became the most celebrated soldier in the Confederacy, and these victories lifted public morale. In a classic military surprise and maneuver, his armies traveled 646 miles in 48 days and won 5 significant victories, with a force of only 17,000 men against a combined force of over 50,000. Jackson accomplished his difficult mission, causing Lincoln to withhold over 40,000 troops from joining the Union forces on the Virginian Peninsula. In July of 1862, Jackson and General Robert E. Lee devised a plan to trick and destroy another 75,000-man army camped outside of Washington, commanded by General John Pope. Jackson began maneuvering his army of 24,000 towards northern Virginia on July 23, 1862. He used mountain gaps as highways and hid his army behind mountains to move quietly and quickly. He arrived in northern Virginia on August 28th and burned a Union supply depot in Manassas Junction to attract the attention of Pope. Pope took the bait and mistakenly thought he had bagged the slippery Jackson. "I see no possibility of escape," Pope said. The two armies collided at the Second Battle of Bull Run. During the battle, some of Jackson's men ran out of ammunition and were forced to use their muskets as clubs, throw stones, and charge with bayonets. Lee's army, the second part of the trap, arrived through a nearby mountain gap and slammed into Pope's flank. The result was a disaster for Pope, who lost over 10,000 men as he retreated in disgrace. Jackson was once quoted as saying to another Confederate officer, "Always mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy if possible, and when you strike, overcome him." After the Confederate victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee felt that the time had come to invade the North and to bring the reality of war to their doorstep. Lee's plan called for his army to cross the Potomac River into Maryland and continue northwards toward Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. In the path was the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, which was protected by Union forces. Stonewall took the task of neutralizing the forces in Harper's Ferry. He seized the town quickly and captured 12,000 men, which was the highest number of prisoners taken in American history. In September of 1862 at Antietam and December of 1862 at Fredericksburg, Jackson and his army fought defensive battles but were victorious despite being outnumbered 2-1. In the spring of 1863, the Confederacy faced a third invasion by the Union Army of the Potomac. This invasion was led by General Joe Hooker with an army of 135,000 men. Hooker's troops formed around the small town of Chancellorsville. Most generals, facing the prospect of being attacked on two sides outnumbered 2-1, would have undoubtedly quickly retreated from harm's way. To Hooker's amazement, Jackson launched an immediate attack on the Federal line. Hooker was so stunned by Stonewall's bravery that he ordered his larger army to retreat. On the evening of May 1st, 1863, Lee and Jackson met. Jackson proposed dividing the Confederate army, that he would march a 26,000-man, bold flanking movement across the Union front, which was shielded by a forest, and strike the Union right. In the words of Lee's biographer, Emory Thomas, this was audacity to the point of madness. Jackson succeeded in his march, and on May 2nd, 1863, his army was in place, ready to strike a clueless Union right flank. At 5:15, Stonewall gave the command to attack. The Union army was completely surprised, and they scattered in terror, running for their lives. The entire flank of the Union army was shattered and chased for the next 2 hours. Jackson refused to let up. He wanted to press his attack through the night, but he knew his troops were worn out and he worried about a Union counterattack. Jackson himself scouted ahead of his lines to see how best to proceed. While returning on horseback, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own troops, who mistook him for a Union party scout. The South won the Battle of Chancellorsville because of Jackson's heroics, but Stonewall died days later of complications from his wounds. After hearing that Jackson's arm had been amputated, Lee said, "He had lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." The military power of the Confederacy was never the same after Jackson's death. The South had no more great victories after Chancellorsville. Thomas Stonewall Jackson met and exceeded the standards of a great American leader. He may have stood for the wrong side of the war, but he was an outstanding military leader. Jackson's inspirational traits encouraged thousands of hungry, poor, and underdressed men to walk hundreds of miles and successfully fight in 5 separate battles. When the odds were against him, and he was outnumbered by the North, Jackson continued to persevere and overcome adversity. Jackson led his men with powerful, moving speeches, but more importantly, through his actions. Jackson did not sit in a tent a safe distance away. He was right in the battle, leading his men by example. Jackson earned great respect from his men for these traits, and he was also respected by the North, who greatly feared him and his overwhelming power. Finally, Jackson was endeared by the South. Jackson was their hope and gave the South an urge to fight on until the very end. It was for these traits and qualities that Thomas Stonewall Jackson will always be regarded as an outstanding American leader.